Hello and welcome to our December Health Action webinar. This is Justin Mendoza from Families USA here to talk to you about drug pricing in 2019 and beyond. Some of you may have noticed from the invite to now that I am not Katherine Elaine. Just wanted to address that by letting you know that Kimberly unfortunately got caught up with a flight that was delayed, so she will not be able to join us today. However, I'm standing in her place, so definitely not as a replacement. So today we're going to talk about the prescription drug pricing scene in 2019, what's been happening, and diving in. I'll start by running through quickly our agenda. Of course, after my introductions here, we're going to hear from Katherine Horine, who's a patient advocate who's been sharing her story with Families USA and has a lot to tell us about what prescription drug costs and prices actually mean to her. Then we'll dive over to our partner, Shawn Dixon from the West Health Policy Center, to dive into what's actually happening in the policy space around drug costs. And then over to our own Shawn Gremminger to talk more about the legislation and what happened this year in the 116th Congress. At the end, as always, we will have our Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, just go ahead and enter your question in the chat box, which should be on the lower left-hand side of your screen. We are recording today's presentation, so if you don't catch something, no worries. You'll be able to come back and watch it later. And we'll also make sure that the slides are available after the call. So just to get us started, just as a recap for anyone who's new to our audience here, we at Families USA are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to ensure that everyone has access to the best health and health care possible. We work in really 4 different domains around coverage, health equity, healthcare value, and consumer engagement. So today we'll be diving into a few of those spaces, really focusing mostly on healthcare value through prescription drug costs and on the consumer engagement and consumer experience world by hearing from Katherine and diving in. Prescription drug prices are core to the work that we work on because we believe that this is one of the areas that the market is actually failing a lot of consumers and that we have an opportunity to make a real lasting change that impacts everyone. Just to color that, the scale of the problem, we know that high and rising drug prices are leaving people with impossible choices. From a recent poll conducted by Consumer Reports, we know that folks are really deciding things like not filling their prescriptions, which can have detrimental health effects, switching to different prescription or different over-the-counter drugs even without consulting their doctors, or incurring more debt, paying other bills late, or spending less on their family or groceries in order to afford high prescription drug prices and costs that affect them directly. So this has become a growing concern and a growing issue as prescription drug prices continue to rise. But all of that being said, rather than just hearing from me, I want to introduce Katherine Elaine from Illinois, who's going to tell us her story about her experience and what's been going on in her life when it comes to prescription drug affordability. Katherine, I'll turn to you now.
Thank you. Well, my story starts really 17 years ago with one medical condition that was very hard to diagnose. And then I got another diagnosis. So I have multiple medical conditions, but the biggest issue in my life happened 6 years ago when I got very sick with a rare, difficult to diagnose lung disease and ended up having to have a lung transplant. So on top of what I was already dealing with, now I was dealing with monumental medical issues, the likes of which are hard to describe unless you are living it. But so I've been post-transplant 5 years, just had my 5-year anniversary in November. And while my lung is doing fantastic, due in large part to all the drugs I have to take to keep it from rejecting, it's very expensive to be a transplant patient and then also have other medical issues as well. I spend the average annual expenditure for medications is like $10,000. for me. I know others spend more, but for me, that's half of my disability income. So that doesn't leave much left to pay for rent and utilities and, car insurance and gas, to go to all those doctor's appointments and things of that nature. So it's a real hardship. So it impacts my life in that I don't do anything besides go to doctor appointments and things of that nature. I like to joke that I've given up having fun because I have no money for it. It all, when you're spending $10,000 a year on medication, $10 for a movie is just not something that I'm willing or can afford to spend. So it's a challenge day to day. And then there's things, other things that keep going up, costs like my supplemental premium for my health insurance, took a huge jump this past year. I guess they figured out I was expensive. So yeah, the big takeaway for me is that I don't have any money left to I can't travel, I can't go to the movies, I can't go out for entertainment. I do watch what I spend at the grocery store, as you showed in that previous slide. I don't skip my medications. So I'm good about that. I have walked out of the emergency room one time because that's too long to get into. But, it's just really expensive. And, it just feels like I shouldn't have to live that way. Nobody should. That, I know people in my lung transplant support group feel the same way. Their medications are, are a lot as well. And, their lifestyles have been, changed just as mine has. So, it's expensive. The only good news I have to say is, in this case, Medicare covered my actual transplant 100%. I didn't have to pay for that. So they saved my life in that regard. But now it's, I feel like every time I look at my checking account, there's money going to somebody, and it's usually Walgreens. So.
Thank you, Katherine, for sharing your story. I think a number of the themes you raised here are some that folks can relate to all across the country, unfortunately, in this battle to really, rein in prescription drug costs. And, I wanted to highlight one piece there that we'll dive into on the policy side of a little bit more as we continue our discussion today. But one piece being that, exactly what you said, that the transplant was paid for. The drugs are the area that's a gap. Thank you. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, and we'll and
I'll just make one quick point is that part of the problem with the drug coverage too is every year the gap, the donut hole, if you will, goes up. So it's harder and harder every year to get out of the donut hole, which is where your drugs are the most expensive.
Absolutely. You just got a lot of head nods here in Families USA's headquarters, folks around the table. Excellent. All right. So to connect back to Katherine's story, and hoping that folks who are tuning in are hearing this and diving into the themes here that are coming forward, we're going to now move over to talk about the drug cost policy wins and changes that have come about, and also the main kind of key takeaways that folks have been focusing. I'm going to turn to Shawn Dixon, Health Policy Director at West Health Policy Center, to dive in and take us away on the policy.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you, Katherine, for sharing your story. It's stories like that I think are really important in ensuring that we're targeting our policy solutions and our advocacy to put forward solutions that are actually responsive to the needs of folks who have expensive drugs. I'm joining from the West Health Policy Center. The West Health Policy Center is part of the West Health family of organizations, which are a nonpartisan, nonprofit group of organizations working to lower healthcare costs to enable successful aging. So today I want to talk about where Congress and policymakers have tried to address the cost of drugs and how those trickle down to consumers. So there are three main areas that have been the focus, and there are several policy levers that have been put forward under each of those. And those have been introduced in various ways into the Congress, and our other Shawn will talk more about that process a bit later. But first we wanted to go through these different policies and make sure that folks understand them so that when you are talking to legislators in your district, when you are trying to explain to other consumers what the proposed policy solutions are, that you have an understanding of some of the details, and we're happy to answer any questions about those during the question and answer. The three key issues have been how to control what seniors pay out of pocket, what folks on Medicare pay, but also recognizing that just controlling what people pay doesn't necessarily control the total cost of drugs. And unless we address the total cost of drugs, we'll end up financing that through taxpayer dollars and higher premiums in the insurance market. So the other two areas that Congress has looked at is how to deal with drugs that have prices that are going up year after year, and then also how to deal with drugs that don't have any competition, where the manufacturer can basically charge whichever price they'd like without having to negotiate for any discounts in order to encourage people to use their product. So we'll break each of these down in turn. The first issue is the out-of-pocket spending for seniors in the Medicare program. As Katherine pointed out, there is really no cap on how much you can spend for your drugs right now. We have both the donut hole, where you have large costs within a particular month. Then you also have the fact that once you reach the catastrophic phase, the sort of final phase of the Medicare Part D benefit, you keep paying those costs throughout the entire year. And so the two approaches that policymakers have taken have been both to look at how can we reduce what people spend in a particular month, but also how can we ensure that there is a cap on that spending across the entire year. So for month-to-month costs, one of the clearest examples of trying to reduce that is proposals to restructure the Medicare benefit design to either close or eliminate the donut hole so that costs are more predictable from month to month. The other approach has been to look at what the deductible is, that initial payment you make at the start of the year, and allow plans to find ways to smooth that out across the year. So this would be an approach where, yes, you incur an entire expense in the first month, but we're going to let you pay it in installments over the course of the year. And that makes it a little easier for people to afford their first prescription in January. The bigger sort of overall change that's been proposed has been to cap how much people are allowed to spend the entire year in Medicare, and set a cap at which point Medicare itself will take over the responsibility. And so to do that, they've proposed two options. One is a formal cap at different amounts depending on which legislation we're looking at. But the other is also to make sure that that cap doesn't just result in taxpayers footing the entire bill. And to that end, they've required that manufacturers offer larger amounts of contribution to the program. Right now, manufacturers offer a discount or a payment into the Medicare program under the donut hole phase. And in the proposed legislation, it's moved to the catastrophic phase. So for those drugs that are enormously expensive and that you'll be taking for the entire year, they want to ensure that those manufacturers are offering a discount to Medicare as part of that reduction in beneficiary cost sharing. So while those approaches may reduce the cost that individual seniors face at the pharmacy counter, they don't necessarily slow the growth of prescription drug prices overall and the amount that we're paying as a society for those. So the next proposal has been to look at the prices of drugs and how they increase over time. And there are three different policy levers that are being considered here. The first issue that's being addressed is how much these drugs cost overall, right? If you take a price increase year over year, the drug gets more expensive. We want to make sure that that's not raising costs to the system. But the other issues are a little bit more complex. The first is cost shifting to patients. The idea here is that when you increase the list price of a drug, even if you offer a discount to the insurer after the fact, when you use coinsurance and you require a beneficiary to pay a percentage of the drug's cost, and you have an increased drug price, that means we're shifting the cost of that drug out of premiums and over to the sick individual who needs it. And so for many years, both insurers and drug manufacturers have been supportive of year-over-year price increases, even if there are discounts after the fact. Because what it does is it moves the cost of these drugs to beneficiaries and away from premiums. And that does two things. One, it makes the premiums cheaper, and that's how these companies compete. But two, in some ways, it also makes people less likely to get their drugs. And by making it less likely for folks to pick up their drugs, we reduce spending overall at the expense of people's health. And so that's another problem. The third concern with price increases over time is that they create a new reference price for drugs that are newly launched, right? So if we take a price increase every year and then we not launch a new drug in that category, it's much easier to launch it at a price that is similar to that price increase over time. And so the other concern with drug increases year over year is we want to slow those down to make sure that we don't keep seeing growth in launch prices of drugs over time. So what has been proposed here to combat all three of these is to require drug manufacturers to pay Medicare a rebate for price increases over the rate of inflation. They could still sort of set that price in the market, but they would have to make an additional payment into the Medicare program to offset that. That payment is hopefully high enough to discourage them from taking those price increases in the first place and to slow this growth over time. The third area of policy concern that has been addressed in recently proposed legislation in the House is looking at drugs that don't have competition and how can we reduce those prices when there isn't an ability to prefer another drug as an incentive to lower your price. Where we have drugs that have competition, we have seen some success from insurers in the Medicare program to be able to bring down those prices through negotiation. But for drugs that don't have significant competition, they're able to charge whatever price they want. And so the two ways that the legislation is proposed to address this is to both require that manufacturers engage in some form of good faith negotiation as a condition of having their drugs covered by the Medicare program, but two, to make sure that we have a backstop to that negotiation, that there's a maximum price that we're allowed to achieve under that negotiation. The manufacturer just can't show up and offer a 10% discount if the drug is enormously expensive and expect that to work. So instead what's been proposed is to look at the prices that other countries pay and use that as a benchmark for what the U.S. will pay. The proposal has put this at about 20% more than what other countries pay, so the U.S. would still be paying the highest prices in the world, but it's expected to be significantly below the prices we're paying now. And this sort of mandatory negotiation is what these other countries use to achieve those lower prices, and so the U.S. is really following the model of doing that, bringing down the prices of these drugs without competition and hopefully slowing the cost growth of drugs over time. So these are the three sort of concerns that have been addressed in recent legislative proposals, trying to address the cost that patients face at the counter in the Medicare program, trying to slow the rate of price increases over time, and trying to ensure that we achieve lower prices on drugs that don't have competition. And from that, we'll turn it over to Shawn, who'll talk a little bit about how that has fared in the current Congress.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shawn, for laying this all out and giving everyone a bit more context here on really what the policy proposals are and the key areas being addressed. Like Shawn Dixon said, we'll turn it to Shawn Gremminger to dive into what's happened in the 116th Congress.
Thank you very much, Shawn and Justin. It's a pleasure to talk to all of you today. So Shawn did an excellent job sort of walking through the particular problems and the policy solutions that have been put forward. As we talked about, I'm going to talk about what's happened so far in this Congress, what has not happened, which is a lot, what is plausible next year, and then frankly, what are a set of things that we expect, if we're going to see real action on it, probably won't be until 2021. So going to the next slide, I like to think about legislation as being sort of like a train. People talk about legislative vehicles and riders. To me, the train analogy makes the most sense because you're talking about various different provisions, which sometimes are a piece of their own legislation and sometimes are strung together with a bunch of other provisions. Increasingly here in D.C., it's hard to move small freestanding legislation these days, so often various different policies, sometimes completely unrelated to one another, will get jammed together in a set of bills. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now in December. This is kind of the time in which these big omnibus bills come together with various different, we'll call them train cars. So there are three different bills that include some of the legislation that Shawn, or some of the provisions that Shawn discussed. I've given them cute names based on what they might be called if they were actually trains. So there's H.R. 3, the Pelosi Express, S. 2543, the Finance Zephyr, and S1895, the helpline. And we'll walk through each one, talking about what's in it, what's not in it, and what's happened so far. So H.R. 3, and I apologize, there's a lot of information on this slide, but this is the most comprehensive legislation that's been considered this year. It really is the sort of the big deal that Democrats promised in the 2018 election and what they've tried to accomplish. And it is the most significant piece of drug pricing legislation ever to be brought up in a chamber of Congress, certainly ever to be passed by a chamber of Congress. And it passed recently. But the story really was one of hurry up and wait. Before we get to that, just very quickly walking through, Title I of the bill was Medicare negotiation on Part D drugs with a backstop based on international reference pricing, just as Shawn described. That is the most partisan and controversial of the various titles. It is broadly supported by Democrats, has been for years. Not generally supported by Republicans, although there are a few exceptions, namely President Trump. He ultimately came out against H.R. 3, but has on the campaign trail and since then talked about the need to negotiate prices for drugs. So the president is at least potentially an ally on this particular issue, but most Republicans are not there. Title II, the inflation caps, or as Shawn described, they're really inflation rebates. That provision is very much splits the Republican Party. Broadly supported by Democrats, I'd say Republicans, depending on who you ask, are maybe 50-50 on it. As we'll talk about in a moment, Chairman Chuck Grassley of the Finance Committee is a proponent, included it in his legislation, but there are quite a few Republicans who don't like it. It's sort of the high watermark for potential bipartisan legislation. Title III is the Medicare Part D restructuring and out-of-pocket cap for seniors, also described by Shawn. That one is more broadly popular, and really, although there are certain differences on how it can be structured, is something that both parties seem to be largely getting behind. And then Title IV is actually completely unrelated to prescription drug pricing. The first three titles of the bill save more than $500 billion over 10 years. Really shows you how much we are overpaying for drugs. And that's just $500 billion for the federal government. That doesn't even count the amount of money that all of us as consumers would save. House Democrats wanted to make sure that that money was reinvested in places that we feel are helpful and necessary. And so Title IV reinvests those savings, particularly in the most significant expansion of Medicare that would occur since it was first created in 1965. Expanding coverage for oral, healthcare, vision, and hearing. And those expansions basically eat up all but about $5 billion in the savings in H.R. 3. As you can see in that quick timeline, we've been hearing about this bill since the election. It took a very long time to come out, painfully so, frustratingly so. But the Congress, the wheels tend to move pretty slowly. I put on here the House passage of H.R. 1. That was one of the big features in the For the People agenda that Speaker Pelosi announced the previous November. When they got that done on March 8th, I thought, all right, this is good. They're moving on to prescription drugs next. We didn't actually end up seeing H.R. 3 rolled out until September the 19th in the very busy fall. Committee markups didn't happen until October. All of that meant that some of the discussion on bipartisan bills basically got truncated and ultimately sort of thrown out, which will get us to where we are in just a moment. H.R. 3 was finally passed by the House of Representatives on the 12th. That was just last week. We can officially say it is bipartisan legislation, although maybe only nominally. Every single Democrat in the House of Representatives who voted for the bill, which is really quite a feat unto itself. It did also manage to pick up 2 Republican votes, which is, hey, it's a start. All right. So the next piece of legislation that we've been focused on this year, you can think of it in some ways as being similar to H.R. 3, but you take out the most controversial piece, which is the negotiation over Part D drugs in Medicare. But it does include strong inflation caps, a Part D redesign with an out-of-pocket cap, and a real improvement in price transparency. I called this one the Finance Zephyr. It came out of the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over Medicare and Medicaid. The credit to the chairman and the ranking member, Grassley and Wyden, who came out with the bill, they publicized the bill on July 23rd, and they marked up on July 25th. That's about as fast as you can possibly move. It was probably a smart move because they knew that that pharmaceutical industry was going to hate it, and they figured let's just move it as quickly as we can. They did manage to get it out of their committee, although with a minority of Republicans actually voting for it. From there, it continued to be debated, but we didn't see any public movement on it until this month. Both Grassley and Wyden are very senior senators. They know how D.C. works, and they released an updated version of the bill on December 6th that made a couple of changes to some of the prescription drug provisions, but they also put in a whole bunch of other healthcare extenders that they knew needed to pass. Their idea was basically, we're going to grease the skids and make this as easy as possible to put into an end-of-the-year legislation in their version 2.0. Things were actually looking pretty good. As of December 9th, the White House came out and offered their support and said they were on it, and I thought there was actually a reasonable chance we would see this bill getting across the finish line this year. Unfortunately, on December 16th, that's literally just 2 days ago, the leaders of the House and Senate announced what their end-of-the-year budget package would look like, or their funding package, and it did not include anything from S-2543. The last piece of legislation I want to mention is also a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate. As you may know, the jurisdictional lines on Capitol Hill don't make a lot of sense, and so the Finance Committee has jurisdiction over healthcare entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, etc. The Health Committee, which stands for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, has jurisdiction over most other healthcare items that are not entitlements. So they put out a bill that was pretty significant. It went way beyond just prescription drug pricing. It sought to ban surprise billing, which has been another priority for Families USA. It made some real changes in transparency over price, health IT, you name it. It was a very large, comprehensive bill, but it had an entire title on prescription drugs. And I'd say the major themes were on cutting down on patent and market exclusivity abuses, in particular a bill called CREATES, which makes it easier for generic manufacturers to get a hold, manufacturers of biologics, to get a hold of samples to be able to create generic biologics, and banning something called pay for delay, in which brand name manufacturers actually pay generics not to come to market. I put S-1895 as a tale of frustration. It very similarly met with a swift defeat in just a couple of days ago. The bill was unveiled all the way back in June. It was marked up in July. We felt pretty good about it and thought that there was a reasonable chance it could get included in the end of the year package. Like the finance bill, it did not, with the exception of CREATES. CREATES is the only significant prescription drug bill that did manage to make it across the finish line this year, in part because it saves money, although most of the bills we're talking about save money. But Congress needed to pay for some vital healthcare extenders into the next year, and CREATES saves about $4 billion over 10 years. Not nothing, not huge, but we're very pleased that at the very least CREATES got done. It has been a priority for Families USA. By comparison to some of the other things we're talking about, it's pretty small potatoes, but you sort of take your victories where you can get them sometimes. Which brings us to what lies ahead. So, as I said, there's a Congress, as part of their end-of-the-year budget deal or their funding deal, extended some vital healthcare programs, including community health center funding, National Health Service Corps funding, some other safety net funding streams that we very much support, not through the end of the fiscal year, but to May 22nd. That sounds like a random date. It happens to be the day before Congress goes into a recess. That's why they chose it. That is really the next and probably last potential legislative vehicle, or we'd say train, that will go out of the station on the healthcare space before the election. It is frankly farther out than I would like. I really would have preferred Congress to have done a much shorter term extension to try to keep the pressure up. Something into like February would have been great. They delayed it all the way out till May. I will say I'm disappointed and I am skeptical about the ability to move major bipartisan legislation in an election year, and honestly less than 6 months before a general election. That being said, it is not impossible. It has been done, and we are going to be pushing for it. So in addition to surprise bills, again, another priority for Families USA, we are going to be spending most of January probably trying to figure out what we think has the best possible support coming out of the Grassley, Wyden, and Alexander Murray bills, and see whether we can actually get something done by May 22nd. As I said, one of the nice things about these bills is they actually save money. Most of the time here at Families, we're up on Capitol Hill asking to spend more money and getting told, no, we don't have more money to spend. In this case, we are asking for legislation that actually saves the federal government money, and then you can either provide tax cuts or buy a battleship or whatever you want with it. But we have, I think, the opportunity because we can save some money on this. So May 22nd is our next big day, and we can talk more about how you as supporters can help try to push for some of these bills before May 22nd. After that, I think we really are talking about building the movement for more significant action in 2021 after the general election. I think there'll probably be more discussion on this as part of the Q&A, but one of the fascinating things about prescription drugs is that unlike the coverage battles that we know so well and which tend to be very, very partisan, prescription drugs are much less so. Democrats tend to be a little bit more friendly to some of the drug pricing changes than Republicans, but that is not universally so. And there are quite a few Republicans, including this administration, who are friendly to the idea of significant changes in how we pay for prescription drugs, which means that regardless of how the election goes, regardless of who the next president is going to be, whether Democrats take back the Senate, et cetera, I think there really will be an opportunity for real prescription drug reform in 2021. And I look forward to working with all of you between now and then.
Excellent. Thank you, Shawn. So as we move into the Q&A, I'm going to open us up first with a reminder to folks to just enter your questions into the chat box, which should be on the lower left-hand side of your screen. But also, I wanted to start us off with questions that are related mostly to Medicare and the new HR3, the Medicare negotiation bill. So the first one really related to the bill, just really quickly, can you just talk about which Republicans were actually on board, and also tied into that, does HR3 foreshadow what Democrats would do if they were in power in 2021?
Sure, I'll provide very quick thoughts, and then Shawn may have more to add. So there were the two Republicans that signed onto or supported HR3 were Representative Fitzpatrick, who's from Pennsylvania, very moderate Republican, and Representative Herrera Butler, who is from Washington State. Also, both of them are from pretty swingy districts, so places where being on the right side of this issue could be helpful in the coming election. So very pleased that we have those folks. And again, I think there are plenty of other Republicans who are at least amenable to a lot of these policies. We don't think that 2 is the ceiling for who can support these bills. We hope it's very much that it's the floor. I do think that HR3 does provide a good blueprint for what we would expect out of a lot of the Democrats who are running for president. Certainly, as we've talked about, the idea of having Medicare negotiate on the price of drugs in Part D, Part B, is not a new one. This is the first time we've seen it get this far, but on the Democratic side, it's been sort of part of the platform for quite a while now. As I look at it, I think all of the major candidates who are running have supported HR3 and what they tried to accomplish. I think the question, in an event where you have a Democratic president and an amenable Congress, is HR3 sort of, as we talked about, is it the floor or is it the ceiling? Mm-hmm. As big as HR3 is, and we can talk more about this, and it is big and it is good and it would save a lot of money and we'd be very pleased, it still does not actually get to what we consider the underlying problem in the way that we pay for prescription drugs in the United States, which is the significant abuse of the patent and market exclusivity systems by pharmaceutical manufacturers. So even beyond HR3, there's still so much more that we can and should do, but we're talking about stuff that's going to take years and decades.
Yeah.
This is the other Shawn here from West Health Policy Center. I think it's important to look at what happened with HR3 in the context of everything else that was happening in the House right now, particularly at the impeachment trial, because we know that there are a lot more Republicans and conservatives who are supportive of trying to reduce the cost of pharmaceuticals and actually voted for the bill. And the environment in which this vote was taken probably affected the number of those who are willing to show their support for something that was led by the Speaker's office. That said, there is a lot more opposition from the highest levels of Republican leadership on the Senate side, and so that's made it more challenging to see a complete way forward under the current power arrangement. I think the other question is going to be sort of what is the coalitions that can be built to support this much broader, right? we start to see some groups that don't usually play well together supporting this legislation. There are employer coalitions that are supportive of it because H.R. 3, as written, would have extended some of these discounted prices to the commercial market. For that same reason, you saw labor unions in support of it. You saw the insurance industry tentatively sort of in support of it. It does regulate them a little bit and takes away some of their power, but they also understand the importance of reducing these costs so that their products are more competitive. And so you're getting a lot of groups that usually don't play well together, and that bodes well for building a broader bipartisan initiative here, especially once the political climate might change a little bit next year.
Excellent. All right. So as another question related to this, but not necessarily in the H.R. 3 realm, I know that, and we all knew that a lot of end-of-the-year pieces just moved through in terms of the budget and other pieces there. For the Shawns, are there any pieces in the end-of-the-year package that you'd like to talk about further? I know that we already talked about the CREATES Act and touched on that development, but I know there are other pieces that maybe are a little bit of a backslide in prescription drug pricing that might be worth noting.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. So as Justin said, there are actually two ways in which consumers have been made worse by action and lack of action in this December budget deal. One is, and it's fairly technical, but I think can best be described as the Congress, or I should say pharma, managed to slip in a provision at the last minute into the budget deal that reclassifies certain drugs as, I'm trying to make sure I'm getting it the right way, from biologics to the other way around. From small molecule drugs to biologics, thus lengthening their market exclusivity for an additional 7 years. It's technical and it looks small, but it's kind of the par for the course of what we expect out of the pharmaceutical industry. Very much a last minute, got thrown in and didn't really get noticed until after the bill was put to bed. So that's going in the wrong direction. And then another one that has not gotten enough attention, which is there's actually an expiring ACA provision which limits cost growth in Part D. That expires at the end of this year, which means that for many Part D beneficiaries, your out-of-pocket cost could go up by as much as $1,250 next year. A real disappointment that Congress couldn't even maintain what we had. We heard from Katherine at the beginning of the call that the donut hole gets wider and that her ability to pay for drugs in Part D is getting harder. Unfortunately, it's going to get that much harder next year because of congressional inaction.
I'm crying. I'm crying right now. Sorry.
No, actually, Katherine, I was going to turn to you in general to elaborate on any of your comments and thoughts around Part D's, the donut hole in general, but also, if you have any thoughts about or reactions to what Shawn just laid out.
Well, I just did. I sent in a question. I typed in. You refer to all these bills lowering drug costs in Medicare for seniors. Not all of us on Medicare are seniors. I've been on. I'm still not a senior. So I presume that means even if you were lucky enough, let's say you passed, you got all your wishes granted, and these bills were passed. If you're not a senior, how does that help those of us that are on Medicare but who aren't seniors yet?
No, that's a really important distinction, Katherine. And what is good about these bills is that as they are written, they would apply to the Medicare benefit broadly. So they really apply to the structure of Medicare Part D plans. So if you are enrolled in a Medicare Part D plan, these changes, were they actually to go into law, would affect everyone. I think the question, though, about the breadth of these provisions is a really good one, and which ones apply only to those in the Medicare program and which ones apply to the broader commercial market. So the negotiation that was considered in H.R. 3 that would look at drugs and without significant competition that were very expensive and use international prices as the metric for those, as written, that would also apply to the commercial market. And so everybody who is commercially insured would have access to those same prices, and manufacturers would be required to honor them. The inflation provisions, though, did not apply to the commercial market. And one of the challenges is that it was very difficult to figure out how to structure that, whether it needs to be a rebate or not. One of the challenges of using a rebate is that that's kind of the current system we have. A lot of drug companies will pay rebates to insurance companies to offset these price increases. But that doesn't stop the price increases over time, right? And those price increases, as we talked about, still increase your cost at the pharmacy counter through coinsurance, and they lead to higher launch prices of new drugs. And so one of the challenges, it was sort of clear how to do it in the Medicare program. It wasn't as clear how to do it in the commercial market, and I think that's an area where we'll see a lot of work in the coming year.
And then a question that just came in as well is diving into, when it comes to H.R. 3 negotiations, what kind of factors is Congress charging the Secretary with taking a look at if H.R. 3 were to become law? Please.
So the negotiation provisions that were established under H.R. 3 require manufacturers to provide a lot of information to the Secretary to use in those negotiations, and there is some consideration of the value of the drug relative to others and its cost effectiveness, some of these other things that information would allow the Secretary to look at some of that. There are still prohibitions against using a strict cost effectiveness framework that have been in there for a long time. But the bigger issue is that we don't actually really expect those to come into play heavily because of this cap that's put in. So the result of those negotiations can't be a price that is more than 120% of what the average price is in other developed nations. And so there's not really a lot of incentive for the manufacturer to negotiate below that price. And so while a lot of information would be given to the Secretary for consideration in that process, we really expect the cap that's put in place to be where most drug prices end up.
And then another question related to one that's come in. I'm going to bring it a little bit broader. So it's one of the least well-kept secrets in Washington that the pharmaceutical industry is a very powerful interest group, a very powerful lobby. The pharmaceutical industry this year is, if you were to put this in a winners and losers spreadsheet, you would say that they've suffered a number of losses with the passage of H.R. 3 through the House of Representatives, with CREATE, and with a number of other things, including the new USMCA having provisions that they fought hard for stripped out of it. What would we say in terms of what do we think is going to be the next big threat on the horizon where we might have to really go toe-to-toe with industry?
It's a great question. I think a couple of things. I mean, as you said, the USMCA, the sort of NAFTA 2.0, was modified significantly in the closing pieces of negotiation in a way that drug companies don't like. At this point, it looks like it's sort of a fait accompli, if you will. It's going to happen, and they're not going to be able to stop it. That doesn't mean that pharma won't find ways to try to strip back on it in the future. I think there are always, every year through a healthcare extenders bill, an appropriations bill, just like what we saw this week on health, on the omnibus spending bills. There are always ways that pharma is able to sort of sneak in and get provisions that are helpful to the industry. I don't necessarily, other than potentially something between now and May 22nd, I don't necessarily see another sort of battle royale with pharma until 2021. I think that's going to be the next big fight. But as I said, one of the things that they are so successful at, and they proved it again this week, is they actually like to be out of the limelight. The more attention that is paid to their abusive practices, the worse they are. And so, a slow time or a quiet time in D.C. is exactly what pharma is looking for, because that's when they can do their most effective work.
I think the other big concern with the pharmaceutical industry over the next year, and as we continue to have conversations about reducing the cost of drugs and how much money we spend on them, is how pharma can take provisions that sound very consumer-friendly and then twist them to benefit the industry. So one of the classic examples of this have been proposals to take the discounts that drug manufacturers provide to insurance companies called rebates and basically extend those to consumers at the point of sale in the Medicare program. And what this proposal would do is it would significantly reduce Medicare beneficiaries' out-of-pocket costs, But because of the way the math in the Medicare program works, it would actually have significantly reduced the amount of money that the pharmaceutical manufacturers give to Medicare and raise the burden on taxpayers by quite a bit. One proposal that the Trump administration put out that seemed well-intentioned and tried to do this really to reduce costs was then forecast to end up costing taxpayers another $297 billion. It's the largest ever regulatory increase in spending that was ever proposed. And so I think we just need to be very careful about getting frameworks to where we seem like they're ready to go, we have agreement on all sides, and then pharma changes the math just a little bit, and it ends up benefiting the industry much more than consumers.
Absolutely. So we've got a lot of work to do to get to the point where we actually do benefit consumers, and I think we're all excited to continue working towards that with the support of folks like Katherine, who was able to share her story here and advocating for the best version of all of these programs that we can get to so we can really control costs. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of close out with that piece, but I do know one thing that's top of mind for a lot of folks in the prescription drug space right now is a new proposal on importation. I do want to give a chance for anyone here to have a reaction to the importation proposal from the Trump administration.
I'll allow my other colleague, Shawn, to go first and then add what Families USA has had to say about it.
Drug importation is a really tricky question because individuals can save a lot of money if they're able to purchase drugs at the prices that are offered in reputable pharmacies in Canada and elsewhere. But it's not necessarily a solution to the high cost of drugs for the nation, right? The Canadian drug market is only 10% of the American drug market, so there's not really a significant way to bring in enough pharmaceuticals to lower our costs. One of the other challenges is if individuals go and get their drugs from other countries, that means they're paying insurance premiums that they're not using to offset the cost of those drugs. And so we want to ensure that folks are getting the benefit of the insurance plans that they've purchased by reforming them to make sure that we are making drugs affordable for everybody in this country. Technically, there are a lot of issues with how importation could work or could not work. FDA commissioners in the past have been very concerned about the safety of some of these drugs, and to its credit, the proposal that came out today attempts to solve some of those issues, but it also makes it much, much harder for drugs to be imported and much more likely for significant enough quantity to be imported to actually reduce prices.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I think we see, if you look at kind of the spectrum of big legislation that can actually make a huge difference, all the way down to tiny little things that feel good but don't actually accomplish much. This one is more on that end of the spectrum. There are certainly we're in favor of anything that's going to have the effect of bringing down drug costs for struggling families. Importation is not a long-term solution. It's not even clear that it's a terrific short-term solution in many cases. But we like the ability to try to put a little bit more pressure on pharma. We support the president's drug reimportation rule, but I think we certainly don't want to oversell it as something that we think is going to make a huge difference in the long run.
Excellent. All right, Katherine, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to provide about your story, about things that we should keep in mind?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that bother me. A lot of it wraps around, and this is your focus right now, and it's an important focus and a big focus is trying to reduce the cost of drugs. But there are things related to this that affect patients every day. I talk to other patients. It's happening. Things like, why all of a sudden does every drug manufacturer who makes drug X, there's a shortage? And then all of a sudden it comes back online and, gee, now it's more expensive. That's an issue that, is a curiosity to me and that nobody can ever explain. And then things like insurance companies who control. I got a letter the other day saying, my doctor's prescribed during the summer a rescue, an inhaler I take every day. But in the summer, because of the weather, I have a hard time breathing. So they prescribed a higher quantity for the summertime to use as a rescue inhaler. And I just got a letter from my insurance company saying I can't have that many anymore. So things of that nature are also big problems that, you know, so what am I, so next summer, I'm not supposed to leave my house, you know, because I can't get enough, because all I get is the one that covers what I need for a full month. Isn't enough to cover if I use more because I'm outside, you know, and I need to use my rescue and my inhaler for a rescue. I'll be using more than I'm really supposed to use, and I'll run out before 30 days. But I won't be allowed to be given any more than that. And that's the insurance company controlling that. And, you know, that's a big deal. We get letters all the time saying we're not going to cover this drug anymore. You know, well, why not? You know, what makes, you know, and so these drug limits, things like that, those are all also big issues because they do affect us. They affect our health more than anything. But it's also, you know, there's been a recent drug shortage of an anti-rejection medication. How does that happen? You know, that's, you know, it hasn't affected me. I'm still getting mine. But I have talked to people online who have experienced not being able to get that particular anti-rejection medication. So then the doctors have to scramble and try something else and hope it works and the patient doesn't go into rejection. So those are all big issues, as well as the bigger issue of cost and everything. I wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Katherine. And your experience definitely shares, I think, something that, again, you know, is really reflected across the entire population when it comes to this. I think, you know, hearing a bit about, you know, the way that the insurance company decisions to try to control costs on their end do affect health and do affect livelihood is an incredibly important example of why we have to address the root cause around prescription drug costs instead of relying on just coverage-based solutions like modifying the formularies or modifying limits on types of drugs that can be purchased when. And, you know, also connecting back to the shortage issues, I think, you know, for all of us at Families, we look at that as one that's kind of the other side of the same coin when it comes to the bigger flaws in the pharmaceutical system. So thank you so much for raising both of those here and keeping those top of mind for folks to think about when thinking about, you know, the actual experience of patients and what's actually happening out there beyond our, you know, the policy levers that we are trying to move to make all of this better. Thank you so much for that. And
oh, you're welcome.
Absolutely.
I could go on for days, but I'll stop now.
Well, we will definitely make sure we have opportunity to continue connecting with you and making sure that happens. I want to bring up our kind of closing remark here, which is just to remind folks on this call that we have coming up Health Action 2020. It's our 25th annual Health Action Conference. Shawn Dixon will actually be one of our speakers at one of our workshops as well. And of course, you'll hear from Shawn Gremminger and others from the family side of things as well at the conference. We'll be registrations currently open for the conference at the end of January, the 23rd through the 25th. Come and join us here in DC to continue these conversations, to take a deeper dive on prescription drugs and multiple other issues, including, you know, coverage, surprise medical billing, healthcare value, healthcare equity, and the list goes on and on. We would love to have as many of you as we can come and join us here in person to continue these conversations and continue moving towards the best health and healthcare for everyone. So in closing, we'll thank you all for joining us today, and be on the lookout for our next webinars as we go into 2020. We will be really excited to continue conversations. If you want to reach out to Families USA, reach out to us at familiesusa.org, or send an email to us at info@familiesusa.org, and we'll make sure to send those along or connect. And if you want to reach Shawn, we can, Shawn Dixon, that is, from myself, we will absolutely pass on your correspondence there as well. Thank you all for joining, and we'll talk to you all very soon.
Thank you.